Okay.
No, sir.
All set.
It's you, Dave.
We're going to meet later
Yeah.
this morning.
Yeah. You set to go?
Yeah, right now.
Okay.
Senior
Good morning. The committee will come to order. Before we begin our markup, I wanted to make a couple of committee announcements in terms of member assignments. Mr. Levin and myself must name members to serve on the Joint Committee on Taxation. It's a tradition for members to be chosen based on full committee seniority. So for the 113th Congress, the members will include the chair, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Johnson, the other gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Rangel. The committee also must make recommendations to the Speaker for the official advisors to the U.S. delegation for international conference meetings. After conferring with the ranking member, our recommendations are the chair, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Johnson, the gentleman from California, Mr. Nunes, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Rangel. We'll now turn to the business before us this morning, which is to consider H.R. 890, legislation that would prohibit the Obama administration from waiving work requirements in the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF, welfare program. Last July, the Department of Health and Human Services issued guidance that for the first time sought to unilaterally allow states to waive work requirements for welfare recipients. The Obama administration issued this guidance without consulting Congress or using sound legal reasoning. In fact, the administration's guidance, in a word, is illegal. The 1996 Welfare Reform Law, which has achieved significant success in moving individuals from welfare to work, allows for very limited waivers and expressly prohibits states from waiving the program's work requirements. The summary of the new welfare reform law this committee published in November of 1996 says simply, and I'm quoting, "Waivers granted after the date of enactment may not override provisions of the TANF law that concern mandatory work requirements." End of quote. Work requirements were central to the success of the bipartisan 1996 welfare reforms, and they've served those seeking to enter the workforce very well. Those reforms led to more work, more earnings, less welfare dependence, and less poverty among low-income Americans. For example, employment of single mothers increased by 15% from 1996 to 2000, and it remains higher today than in 1996, even after 2 recessions. At the same time, welfare caseloads have declined by a remarkable 57%. Before the Obama administration's July 2012 announcement, the fact that these critical work requirements couldn't be waived was accepted as fact by both Republican and Democrat administrations. In fact, in a Human Resources Subcommittee hearing last week, the Government Accountability Office testified that prior to this administration, they, and I'm quoting here again, did not find any evidence that HHS stated it has authority to issue waivers related to TANF work requirements. Despite this historical precedent in both the intent and letter of the law, the Obama administration has refused to rescind their July 2012 guidance. They have, however, attempted to hide their intentions by later announcements saying they will only accept waiver proposals that result in greater numbers of welfare recipients working. But nothing in current law prohibits a state from strengthening its work requirements and moving more individuals from welfare to work. Instead, a waiver would only be needed to weaken the work requirements, as the administration wishes to do, pure and simple. This administration effort is baffling, frankly, especially when you consider where the American people stand on this matter. A survey taken after the administration issued their guidance last year revealed that 83% of Americans support a work requirement as a condition for receiving welfare. Clearly, these men and women believe, as many of us do, that the best way out of poverty is a job. It is critical that our laws both foster job creation as well as ensure that welfare is always a pathway to work. It's unfortunate that we find ourselves in this situation. If not for the administration's waiver policy, we might have a stronger, sounder TANF program. Last year, Republicans and Democrats on this committee were working on a bipartisan TANF reauthorization bill that would have strengthened work requirements and closed funding loopholes. We held a bipartisan subcommittee hearing in May, crafted bipartisan legislative language, and sought HHS technical assistance on that bipartisan draft in late June. Then, without warning, the administration released their July 12 guidance, effectively ending any chances for bipartisan progress the rest of the year as we dealt with their misguided waiver policy. It's time to put this waiver debate behind us so we can get back to making progress together to strengthen the TANF program, including its work and state funding requirements. It was a goal we envisioned last year. It was a goal both sides expressed in subcommittee hearings held last week, and the legislation before the committee today would allow us to do just that. I look forward to its passage by the committee today and continued progress in the House in coming days. And before I yield to the ranking member for any opening statement he wishes to make, I ask that all member opening statements be included in the record. And without objection, so ordered. Mr. Levin.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I heard your opening statement, I must say that I really regret we're having this markup. As someone who worked with others on welfare reform, a difficult and controversial issue, I really think that doing this today is a step backward in terms of bipartisan consideration of how we can implement and improve the welfare reform bill of many years ago. At a time when this committee should be emphasizing a search for opportunities to see if we can find common ground, we have before us a markup that only increases polarization. Today, a regrettable pattern of opposing initiatives put forth by President Obama continues at a time when our nation desperately needs more governing and less political positioning. Many in the majority voted on 3 separate occasions in the past to provide much broader welfare waiver authority than the recent initiative put forth by HHS. The Congressional Research Service has confirmed that all 3 of those Republican bills, and I quote, would have had the effect of allowing TANF work participation standards to be waived, end of quotes. Republican Governor Gary Herbert of Utah has openly expressed an interest in pursuing a waiver in the TANF program to increase the employment of welfare recipients. In December, he said, and I quote, "Campaigns are campaigns, and now it is time to govern," end of quotes. Instead, today we are debating a bill reflecting charges from the presidential campaign on the Republican side that independent fact finders confirmed as false. In labeling the distortion made by Governor Romney and other campaigns during the election a pants-on-fire lie, the Pulitzer Prize-winning fact-checker, PolitiFact, stated unequivocally, and I quote, "By granting waivers to states, the Obama administration is seeking to make welfare-to-work efforts more successful, not end them. What's more, the waivers would apply to individually evaluated pilot programs. HHS is not proposing a blanket national change to the welfare law," end of quotes. Using the same authority that the Clinton administration used to grant dozens of welfare waivers in the mid-1990s, the Secretary of HHS has said she would consider requests from states to run demonstration projects, but only if the projects increased employment by at least 20%. This is an effort to make welfare reform work more, not less effectively, an effort that I have supported and will continue to support. Governors have said that they could put more people to work if they were able to focus more on outcomes and less on bureaucratic requirements. In allowing waivers to pursue demonstration projects, HHS responded to these governors by saying, "Prove it." It would be much better use of our time for this committee to discuss how we address the sequester. Key issues relating to the sequester fall within this committee's jurisdiction. Instead, we are spending time and energy on legislation that is based in part, it goes back to hyped up campaign rhetoric. Colleagues, we can do better than that. I yield back.
Thank you. I'll now turn to Mr. Matt Whitinger, Staff Director for the Subcommittee on Human Resources, to provide the technical description of H.R. 890. I'd ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in general, H.R. 890 would prevent the Secretary of Health and Human Services from waiving the work requirements that have applied under the Temporary Assistance for Needy Family Program since 1996. Specifically, the legislation states that the Secretary may not, quote, finalize, implement, enforce, or otherwise take any action to give effect to the information memorandum dated July 12, 2012, close quote, which HHS issued regarding waiving the TANF work requirements. Further, the legislation says the Secretary may not authorize, approve, renew, modify, or extend any experimental, pilot, or demonstration project that waives compliance with a requirement of Section 407, which contains the TANF work requirements. Finally, the legislation would rescind any waivers the Secretary may have already granted related to the work requirements. The TANF work requirements were established in the 1996 Welfare Reform Law, which this committee principally drafted. The 1996 reforms replaced the prior AFDC, or Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, with the new TANF program. Prior to the enactment of TANF, many states sought waivers of AFDC rules so that they could test work and related requirements for welfare recipients, which otherwise would have been prohibited under AFDC law. Based in part on the evidence from those pre-welfare reform waiver demonstrations, the bipartisan 1996 TANF reforms created strong new work requirements for persons receiving welfare benefits as well as states. These requirements specify the minimum number of hours of work or related activities an individual must engage in each week, how work activities are defined, what share of adults on welfare must engage in work or related activities, and penalties on states, especially for failure to comply, among other requirements. As the chairman noted in his opening statement, an official summary prepared by the committee of the 1996 reforms in November 1996 stated that waivers granted after the date of enactment may not override provisions of the TANF law that concern mandatory work requirements. At the request of Chairman Camp, GAO examined whether HHS had granted any waivers of TANF since 1996. On September 19, 2012, GAO stated, since the creation of TANF, HHS has not granted any Section 1115 waivers related to TANF. Again, as noted by the chairman in testimony before the Human Resources Subcommittee in a hearing held on this topic last week, GAO stated that prior to this administration, they did not find any evidence that HHS stated it has authority to issue waivers related to the TANF work requirements. H.R. 890 closely resembles H.J. Res. 118, which the committee approved on September 13, 2012, and which passed the House on September 20, 2012. That resolution disapproved of the administration's waiver memorandum and stated that it, quote, shall have no force or effect. The Senate, however, did not act on that resolution before the close of the 112th Congress. Mr. Chairman, that completes my walkthrough of H.R. 890.
Thank you. Mr. Reichert, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Usually, if an administration wants to change how a program operates, they submit a legislative proposal for Congress to consider. But that's not what the Obama administration did with its proposal to waive the TANF work requirements. Despite the fact that the Obama administration said in prior budgets they would work with Congress on TANF reforms, they didn't propose any reauthorization changes and instead simply claimed they could waive the current work requirements last summer without even notifying Congress. As Chairman Camp indicated in his opening statement, what really has not come to light until recently is the fact that before the Obama waiver policy was issued, members of this committee were working on a bipartisan basis to reauthorize and improve TANF. Even more incredibly, bipartisan draft legislation had been shared with the Obama administration before they announced their misguided waiver policy. But instead of working with Democrats and Republicans on this bipartisan legislation, the Obama administration announced they would waive welfare work requirements right in the middle of our discussions. As we all saw last year, that completely torpedoed any potential for bipartisan progress last year. Mr. Whitinger, I understand that you have information on the timing of those discussions with HHS. Can you tell me when the Ways and Means Committee first indicated to the Obama administration that the committee would be discussing TANF reauthorization?
Yes, Mr. Reichert. The Human Resources Subcommittee held a hearing on May 17, 2012. That hearing focused on reauthorization topics. They included the topic known as excess MOE requirements, which are a mechanism by which states have basically weaken the work requirements and reduce the number of individuals subject to those work requirements. Members on both sides of the aisle at that hearing, as well as witnesses, expressed interest in closing that excess MOE loophole, strengthening the work requirements.
Did HHS indicate that they were preparing guidance to waive work requirements at any time prior to or after that hearing?
No.
And after this hearing, I understand that discussions began in Congress on a bipartisan basis again around TANF reauthorization proposals, and that HHS became a party to the details of those discussions. Can you tell me when HHS received the draft bipartisan reauthorization proposal to review?
Yes, Mr. Riker. The draft legislation was prepared through the month of June, and then on June 29th, a draft of that legislation was shared with HHS, seeking their technical assistance on the legislation.
Now, that's almost 2 full weeks before HHS announced that they would waive TANF work requirements, correct?
That's right.
What happened next?
Shortly thereafter, on July 9th, committee staff held a bipartisan conference call with HHS, at which some of HHS's technical appraisal of the draft was shared, and it was suggested that written guidance would be provided shortly. Written technical assistance on the legislative draft would be provided. Of course, then that was shortly thereafter followed by the actual release of the HHS information memorandum on July 12th, which had the effect that you described before.
So even while they were still reviewing the bipartisan TANF reauthorization proposal designed to strengthen the work requirements, HHS went forward with announcing they would allow states to waive TANF work requirements altogether?
That's correct.
Mr. Chairman, it's amazing to me that the administration would proceed with this, its waiver policy, especially knowing that real bipartisan progress was being made in Congress. Clearly, we need to act to reject this waiver proposal so we can get back to working together to close loopholes and strengthen the work requirements so more welfare recipients get the help they need to go back to work.
All right. Thank you. Do you want to go to Doggett or?
Just briefly,
Mr. Levin, briefly, and then we'll go to Mr. Doggett.
I want to yield to Mr. Doggett. So I'll yield the rest of my time, so you'll have the rest of that and yours if you need it. But let me just ask you, in this new Congress, have there been discussions about that bipartisan proposal?
No, sir.
So there was work on a bipartisan proposal, and then it stopped, and there's been no effort to rekindle those discussions?
Mr. Levin, the subcommittee had a hearing last week on waiving the work requirements, and there was significant discussion, as Mr. Doggett knows, of considering ways of strengthening the work requirements when TANF is reauthorized. But the purpose of that hearing was to review the effect of waiving the work requirements on work by TANF recipients. So far, that has been the focus of the subcommittee's activity in the one hearing that we've had on that topic.
So because it expires the end of this month, right?
The TANF program, yes.
And in these months since we reconvened, there haven't been efforts to continue discussions on that bipartisan proposal you mentioned?
I think as the exchange with Mr. Reichert suggests, the focus has been on the administration's proposal to waive the work requirements and undoing that.
I think that's the wrong focus.
Mr. Chairman, may I claim 5 minutes of my own
Mr.
time?
Levin has yielded to you, and you can then seek recognition on your own time later, but then
may
we'll
I
go to
ask-
other people in between. But you have Mr. Levin's time if you want it.
How much time remains?
3 minutes and 15 seconds.
All right. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I believe in the value of work. I voted for the 1996 welfare law because I wanted to support moving people from welfare to work. I certainly agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that our laws should foster job creation. I think TANF, though it's had some spotty successes, makes a modest contribution in that regard. Our new chairman, Mr. Reichert, conducted a fair hearing with which I have no quarrel last week. Mr. Weidinger's history on waivers, I have no disagreement with, nor the GAO study. I would say that perhaps the emphasis on a bipartisan alternative is maybe a little overstated. And my objection today to this legislation is not that it's malevolent, but that it's largely irrelevant. About 300,000 people across America are in work activities from TANF today. That equals about 1% of the working age adult population that's below the poverty line. The reason that TANF work rates don't have any impact on 99% of poor working age Americans is because TANF in its current form doesn't provide any help to the vast majority of our fellow citizens living in poverty. Yes, the focus is to be on children, but in my state of Texas, only 1 in 20 poor children receive any direct assistance from TANF. We're at the lowest level nationwide of direct assistance through TANF since 1964. So I think the bottom line is this: whether the waivers under the TANF program are a great success or they're a colossal failure, will have little impact on the overwhelming number of Americans who are struggling to find a good job and climb out of poverty. I feel, respectfully, that this legislation is basically a leftover from the last presidential campaign. The last time that we had an extension of TANF, the major reform that our Republicans colleagues offered was that you couldn't cash your welfare check in a strip club or a casino. Well, I didn't object to that, but it hardly goes to the core issue of how we make this law work better to get people into jobs. And in last year's presidential campaign, the focus was on the fact that the administration was going to wave goodbye and let all these lazy people on the dole be lazy. They'd first give them a waiver and then maybe a pillow and an easy chair so that they could keep shirking their responsibility. Well, I maintain that there are a lot of poor people who can't find a job now that we should be focused on trying to lift them out of poverty. That ought to be one of the objectives, and into the workforce. And I don't think there has been enough effort from the administration in that regard. I agree with you. But there certainly hasn't been much effort out of this Congress in that regard. What we need is a broad effort that is focusing on helping people get into jobs. The waiver would have provided the states, like Utah, which was exploring it, a little more flexibility from what may be overly restrictive requirements. That may be a good idea. In other areas, there's already too much flexibility, and the states have basically used TANF monies to fill their budget gaps and to fund programs they were already funding themselves. There is justification for doing a thorough and careful review of more than just the work requirements and trying to make TANF satisfy its original objective. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. As one of the authors of the 96 law, one of the basic premises of that law was that states would get fixed federal funding in exchange for increased flexibility in the programming, as well as the assurance that at least half of the adults on welfare would be working. And prior to the 96, I mean, that was not just a minor part of the welfare reform legislation, but it was the major piece. And Mr. Whitinger, prior to the 96 law, was there any requirement that people work if they received welfare?
No, they're commonly referred to as work suggestions in effect before welfare reform.
So people were entitled to benefits whether they worked or not.
That's correct.
And obviously some of the work requirement of getting half the adults of the caseload on work also includes preparation for work, does it not?
That's right. There's actually 12 different definitions of work that include what I think would commonly be understood as a job, and other things like vocational training, various other forms of education, community service, and so on.
And prior to this work requirement, states, and I think this is an HHS regulation, what were some of the things that states considered as job readiness before we reformed welfare?
In 2005, the Government Accountability Office issued a report that assessed some of the types of activities that states counted as work under what, at that point, were the parameters of TANF. And those included things like personal journaling, smoking cessation classes, massage in some cases. So there were very extraneous definitions of work that were then tightened in what became the Deficit Reduction Act of 2006 that basically said to HHS, you need to more tightly define what the work activities are and wall off, in effect, those more extraneous activities.
So even though we put a work requirement in the 96 law, that work requirement had to be strengthened because we found that states were sometimes including activities that I think any rational person would not consider as work.
They were quite creative, yes.
And since then, the welfare reform law was enacted. There have been no waivers since the 96 law. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's what GAO told us.
And GAO also said that HHS has never claimed to even have the authority to issue waivers for states.
That's right.
And again, there was no consultation with Congress on this proposal or this informational memorandum.
No, I mean, as my exchange with Mr. Reichert suggested, it really came out of the blue and was not anything that Congress was anticipating.
And what this informational memorandum says is that it suggests that states simply can waive this work requirement. Is that not correct?
That's correct. They can apply for waivers from HHS to waive the rules of Section 407.
Well, I think this legislation is critical given that the track record here and given what the reform of 96 was attempting to do, and the idea that this is just going to hang out there as something that has authority. I think it's very important that we address it and address it with legislation. So with that, I'll yield to Mr. McDermott, or Mr. Rangel. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would have hoped that the campaign issues were over and that this committee, more than any other committee in the House, would come together to see what we could do in a bipartisan way to correct areas of our jurisdiction. But I have to admit that the campaign took this issue, and it goes unchallenged that they tried to make it a political issue in the campaign. It was my understanding that there are work requirements in the TANF law, and that your response of no work requirements dealt with AFDC?
That's correct. That was
so
what
they
the
are
chairman asked.
work requirements under existing law.
That's
Is that correct? And was not the question raised as to whether or not the Secretary had the authority to waive some of the requirements, the work requirements? Is that an issue with us now?
That's the premise of, in effect, the bill before the committee today. It rejects that the Secretary has that authority and
But
appeals.
right now, they do have she does have the authority.
It's the Secretary's claim. That's not the history or understanding of the committee, I would say, in drafting the
I'm talking
welfare
about
law.
the committee that reviewed this issue. Had indicated, Congressional Research Service, didn't they indicate that the Secretary's interpretation of a current authority under this section was waivable under Section 402, is consistent with the Secretary's practice under the same provision that existed before?
That was one of the things that the CRS memo
Yes.
said. It also said that a different argument could be made that the Secretary did not have this authority. I would say the CRS memo was not definitive on that question.
Okay, I will ask staff to provide for me immediately, if not sooner, the provision that put this in doubt, because the part that was given to me said there was no question that she had this authority. Having said that, in the waiver, has there been any states today that have applied for a waiver of the work provisions?
To my knowledge, no.
Has there, then why are we doing this now? Because you believe that there's some states that are going to say you don't have to work in order to receive benefits? Is that what you believe, that this may happen?
I'm not sure it's mine to say what the intent.
I'll say in answer to Mr. Rangel, yes.
Okay, so this was a political
I
issue.
think he was asking Mr. Whitinger the purpose of the legislation, and Mr. Whitinger's job is to give technical support. I will say, in answer to Mr. Rangel, yes.
Okay, so Mr. Whiting has no idea why we have this bill before us. I'll accept that. But I'm asking, the only time to my knowledge, as this became an issue, was during the political campaign, where it was said that if you did not work, you lose your. It was alleged that that you didn't have to work or be involved in a program, and the benefits would not be cut off. And now this is saying that the secretary, no matter what better ideas the governors would have, cannot provide a waiver. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, isn't it true that Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservative, the main objective in this is not punitive, but to get people off of welfare and get them to work? Isn't that it?
That is a goal of the TANF program.
Yes, that's the goal. I didn't use the right word. That's the goal. Now, are there governors that believe and have presented programs like the state of New York that they believe that requiring people to better prepare to get jobs would require a waiver? Is this what this bill is supposed to do, to cut off any other opportunity except straight work and not preparation for work?
No, Mr. Rangel, that's not what the intent of this bill is. There are 12 different definitions of work, including preparation for work under current law. What this bill says is the Secretary may not waive those work requirements in current law and may not waive including those non-work activities in current law. So that the 12 definitions include vocational educational training, but it places some limits on those.
Is there any waiver that has been granted by the Secretary of HHS that does not follow the intent of this piece of legislation before us this morning?
Mr. Rangel, no state has actually sought a waiver.
All right, thank you. Time has expired. Mr. Brady's recognized.
You know, I just want to sort of cut through the confusion here. Today, states have incredible flexibility on preparing welfare recipients to go back into the workforce. They have, as you said, 12 different categories. This is flexibility that's worked well for the states over the years?
Well, I was on the
That's correct.
Under current law, today any state can strengthen their welfare to work programs, by example, expecting more welfare recipients to work, prepare for work. So just so I understand, waivers are only needed to weaken the work requirement. Is that correct?
That's correct. If a state wanted to engage somebody in, instead of 30 hours of work or other activities a week, instead of the 30 hours in current law, to place them in 35 hours, the state wouldn't need a waiver to do that. If, however, the state wanted to place somebody in only 25 hours or 20 or 15 or 10 hours instead of the 30-hour standard, they would require a waiver to do so.
And was it the White House's own guidance that indicated that that their proposal would yield less work for welfare recipients?
Yeah, Mr. Brady, I believe you were making reference to some of the examples that the administration included in the information memorandum that included things like counting
Extending the time period?
extending the time period that education can count as work, extending the time period that job search can count as work. So again, categories that are not work as commonly understood that can be counted as work for longer.
And final question, just sort of cut through all the chatter here. Under the White House proposal, Congressional Budget Office indicated that this would increase welfare spending. Is that correct?
That's correct. CBO issued a score of the committee's prior bill that it acted on, the HJ Res 118, and found that it would cost an estimated $59 million over 10 years. And the reason for that is when states fail to satisfy work requirements, they experience financial penalties. Basically, the federal government will reduce the federal block grant that is payable to a state that fails to satisfy the work requirements. CBO looked at that and said, in effect, well, states that are most likely to fail to satisfy the work requirements will seek to have those waived, which would result in the waiver of the federal penalties. So you would have the ironic situation of states that fail to satisfy the work requirements in current law would actually receive more federal money under the administration's waiver policy than they would under the bill before the committee.
Well, it just makes sense. CBO's looking at it objectively. If these waivers were to strengthen work requirements, we would not be spending more money on welfare spending from the federal level. You know, this bill is regrettable but necessary. You know, the White House should not be undermining these work requirements. Extremely successful program. Truth is, more and more people, as we work hard to get them off the welfare rolls, back into their own incomes, back in being self-sufficient. Again, this is a win-win. of not just for taxpayers, but for families who are trying to work themselves into a job and off the welfare rolls. So strongly support this measure. Thank you.
Mr. McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure if this is exactly the right time to do it, but I would like to recognize one of the staff who's leaving to become the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Services Legislation. Sonia Nesbitt has worked on the Democratic side for as long as I've been on the committee, and no, not that long. For the last 5 or 6 years since I've been in human services stuff, and she's been a wonderful member of the staff, and I think the Obama administration has done well to recognize her and pluck her from our arms. So I'd like to give Sonia, please stand up so people know.
Congratulations. Congratulations, Sonia.
Beyond that, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Rangel and I were having a discussion looking at the law, and Mr. Rangel has, I'm going to yield to Mr. Rangel for a couple of more questions.
It's my understanding under existing law, if we have a welfare recipient that is either illiterate or has no GED or needs help to better be able to get employment, that under the existing law, they would not be able to get that training before working?
No, that's not the case, Mr. Rangel. Somebody who is, for example, a teenager who lacks a high school diploma could be in a GED program and have that be counted as work under existing law.
They would be able to get that training before they go to work?
Yes, sir. That would then be treated as a core activity. That's right.
Well, if they're older than a teenager, if you're 21, can you, I'm trying to find out, and rather than have swordsmanship, could you share with me what provisions the housing authority or the recipient can get training without getting a waiver right now? And I'm trying to see, I'm under the impression that going to school is not considered as preparation for work.
Right.
Could you shatter that myth for me?
Sure. Mr. Rangel, first of all, the most important thing to understand is the work requirements are requirements on states. So the states need to engage 50% of adults in work or other activities. So what that also means is that states can not engage 50% of adults in work and other activities. So in terms of the 21-year-old who requires a GED so that someday they can go to work, they could be part of the 50% that the state doesn't engage at all, simply lets proceed in a GED and then continue to collect their benefits.
What bothers me, and I yield back, is you have to tell us what you're trying to avoid, and so far, nobody has asked for anything that you object to, but still we're denying the Secretary the discretion to waive some of these requirements for something that, in her opinion, could improve the ability of the recipient to get a job. So if you can work that in some kind of way, it'll help this member, and I yield back to Mr. McDermott. Thank you.
Dr. Bustani is recognized.
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you do have some.
Just what Charlie and I were, Congressman Rangel and I were talking about was when we started with this in '96, there were a lot of people who could be easily eased out of public assistance and into the workforce. They had capabilities. They were, for one reason or another, not working, but they had the ability. Over the course of time, states have gradually gotten down to a pool of folks, generally speaking, who I suspect are the most difficult ones to get into a workplace. And you can do all you want to put somebody into a low-wage job, but it may not work if you haven't done some training of them before that. Now, you're saying that 50% of the people, the governor can just train him any old way he wants, but he has 50% that he has to send to work first. Is that correct?
To work or the other activities that are part of the 12, but that's correct. To answer Mr. Rangel's question, there's a general presumption in current law that individuals should be working or doing work in combination with education and training. There's some limited allowances for education only to be counted, but those are generally for teenagers, for example, finishing high school, or individuals who are in vocational educational training, but it's limited to some degree. It's not you can do that for your entire 5 years on welfare. You can do it for some initial period of time, but after that initial period of time, you actually need to be working in something that looks closely to a job.
Okay, all right. Dr. Bustani is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Whitinger, in statements put out by the Obama administration on why they're waiving work requirements, they've said they're responding to state requests for flexibility to ensure the program moves more people to work. In fact, they often cite letters submitted by a few governors asking for changes to TANF, including letters submitted by governors back in 2005 asking Congress to change the law to allow more flexibility. Every year, the administration submits a budget to Congress detailing their legislative proposals, their aspirations. I would like to ask staff to walk us through, to review whether over the last 4 years, the Obama administration has indeed proposed any changes to TANF work requirements. So, Mr. Whitinger, can you tell me what the Obama administration proposed in their fiscal year 2010 budget for TANF?
In their fiscal 2010 budget, there was no new funding and no TANF program changes, for example, to work requirements. I will note that before that, the President signed into law the economic stimulus plan that provided for $5 billion in additional TANF emergency funds and also made some changes that had the effect of weakening the work requirements.
So in 2011, we saw more money for the TANF emergency fund, but nothing in the budget per se in 2011 either.
They proposed more funding. It was not provided. No changes to the work requirements. That's correct.
And what about fiscal year 2012 budget? Any proposal to change TANF at that point in time?
Again, a proposal for more funding, but no program changes.
Okay, and what about 2013?
No new funding, no program changes. The administration in both the last two budgets included some general language discussing how they would like to work with Congress on reauthorization, but there was no specific proposal.
Specifics. So the Obama administration repeatedly said they would work with Congress on TANF reauthorization, but the budgets never proposed any changes to the work requirements. And then instead, they've come out unilaterally announcing that they would, for the first time, ever waive work requirements that were the central feature of welfare reform. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Well, it seems to me, based on this history, this legislation is indeed very important at this stage of the game. And I think I'll answer Mr. Rangel's question. It's also important to protect the jurisdiction of this committee and the legislative prerogative of Congress. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
All right. Gentleman yields back. Any further questions? All right.
I think we've tortured
Mr. Chairman, may I claim time?
Mr. Doggett, yes, you have not had your time on your own time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As our many tax working group meetings indicate, we are not waiting on the administration to tackle the problem of tax reform. We're taking initiative on our own. And my position would be that that's exactly what we need to be doing with reference to this broader issue of trying to move people out of poverty and into the workforce. The TANF program needs to be part of the puzzle and the answer instead of the broken link that it is today. I don't think that some reconsideration of the paperwork requirements that the governor of Utah and other people complained about is necessarily a bad thing. But the way the administration went about this waiver requirement is consistent with Mr. Whitinger's explanation and Dr. Bustani's questions, and I don't agree with that either. I think we should have as a goal the TANF program being part of lifting people out of poverty and into the workforce, and I think it's our responsibility to fashion a broader bipartisan response to that. Whether this law is adopted or is not adopted plays an insignificant and inconsequential role in the lives of poor people across the country and the way that this law will be implemented, the way the TANF program will be implemented. A broader TANF revision ought to be part of a broader effort to lift people from poverty. There are some other things that the administration and this committee does that are very important in that regard. One of those is the Earned Income Tax Credit. The need to defend that Earned Income Tax Credit and maintain its refundability portions. Another is raising the minimum wage to lift people who are the working poor out of poverty, which working at the minimum wage leaves most of them in poverty. This is part of a broader effort. What I would like to see the committee doing, rather than focusing on extending TANF a few months here, a few months there, with a single shot change like this or the casino limitation, is a broader effort that deals with the fundamental problem of poverty in America. Only this week, there was another report on the front page of the New York Times about corporate profits never being better, but jobs not being created and people falling further behind in our society. We have a tremendous amount of poverty in the country that is not being addressed. This is a small way and a small piece of addressing it. I believe we need to be doing a better job than this proposal in meeting that challenge and really in fulfilling the promise of the 1996 revision of the welfare law that the goal was welfare to work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. There being no further questions, are there any amendments to H? Oh, Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do have a question. Mr. Widener, would you be in agreement that a large number of TANF applicants and recipients have very low levels of skill and education, which does not make them good prospects to be able to get a job?
I would be in agreement, especially with the first half of that statement. I think the second half presumes that individuals need a lot of skills to get a job. I think individuals, even without skills, can be engaged in work, and that's actually been shown by the history of welfare reauthorization, that many of the people who were assumed before to need significant additional education were actually able to enter the workforce and achieve work and remain in the workforce, and then as they went, gain additional education.
Let me also ask, would it appear that states might have a better understanding of the characteristics and needs of the populations that they are dealing with than a national standard?
I'm not sure what you mean by a national standard, Congressman. There are 12 different definitions of work, and one of the premises of the welfare reform law was that, yes, states have a better understanding, but there needs to be some bounds on work, and those bounds are reflected in the 12 different definitions.
We talk a great deal about states' rights, and that is the rights of individual states to make determinations. And it seems to me that what the administration is doing is attempting to give states a greater level of opportunity to determine what really works for them and what does not. And if we hamper that, then it seems to me that rather than enhancing the effectiveness of the legislation, that we're actually deterring it.
Well, Congressman, to sort of refer back to Dr. Bustani's point, it's not the administration's right to determine what the law is. The administration executes the law. What the chairman's position, I believe, if I can state it on the waivers, is that there is not authority for the administration to waive the work requirements. And so when the secretary acted and issued the information memorandum, she was exceeding her authority under the law. And so what this legislation before the committee attempts to make clear is that the administration does not have the authority to waive the work requirements under the law.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As it was noted by the witness last year, we took up this same bill. I have the same concerns today as I had at that time. I voted against it then. I'm going to vote against it now. And I'm going to do that because when Congress did welfare reform, I was in the state legislature in California, and I did California's welfare reform
legislation. And we consider the waivers a very important part of our success in carrying out welfare reform in California. We viewed it as one tool in the state's tool chest to accomplish what I thought was everybody's desire, and that was to move people from welfare to work. So again today, I'm going to vote with the states, and I'm going to vote with the governors, and I'm going to vote to put people back to work. And that is to vote against this bill to keep as many tools in the tool chest for the states as possible. And along the lines of what Mr. Doggett said, I look forward to working on a broader bipartisan approach to improving our welfare to work goals. But I don't think this is it. I have one question for the witness. It was stated that the reason that we're doing this bill is out of some concern or fear or understanding that although states aren't running to the administration looking for waivers at this time, but there's some concern that they're going to in the future. Do we have any ideas as to which states are poised to come forward looking for waivers?
Congressman, we've had some conversations with HHS about states that have, in their terms, expressed preliminary interest, mostly at the regional office level, in waivers, but there haven't been any states that have actually come forward.
Does that mean that they are expressing interest in a waiver from the work requirement, or a waiver that will somehow allow them more latitude to make their state programs work better to move people from welfare to work?
I'm not sure about the details of what they've specifically asked for, nor has HHS shared that with us in our conversations. But what I can say is that no state has actually officially applied for a waiver taking up the Secretary on the offer of the suggested authority.
No, we already established that. We're voting on a bill today to end the practice of states getting waivers for the work requirement, something that they've never asked for.
The bill does several things. It says that the Secretary may not provide waivers, and then it also says if in the meantime any states have actually received waivers from the Secretary, that those waivers are rescinded. But yes, the bottom line is that the states would not be eligible to receive waivers, and to the best of our knowledge, no state has actually asked for a waiver.
So a solution looking for a problem. What states are we worried about that may, in fact, sometime in the future apply for a waiver?
I'm in no position to answer that, sir.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I would just
I
say to
yield
Mr.
my time to Mr. Rangel.
Could I ask one question, and that is, what states now have waivers that are being rescinded if this becomes law?
Congressman, no state has applied for a waiver.
No, you said some already have a waiver, didn't you?
No, sir. I said if in the meantime, between today and the passage of this legislation, any states actually received waivers, those waivers would be rescinded.
I see. So we don't have a request for a waiver at this time, nor has anyone ever received a waiver.
That is correct.
Okay.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I would just say to Mr. Thompson, in the GAO letter where they determined that this HHS activity was in fact a rule and subject to the Congressional Review Act, one of the things they analyzed was this of general applicability? This is not a specific state coming to the HHS asking for a change. This was going to apply to all states in any circumstance, and they said that made it actually rulemaking, and because of that, they needed to come to Congress, which they did not do. So, Mr. Larson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witness as well. Well, it seems to me, and I would like to pick up where Mr. Thompson left off, just so that I understand this, since we did take this up back in September. But again, there is no states have asked for a waiver. And because no states have asked or been granted a waiver, the provision that we put in there is that, and even if they did, is just my understanding, that any waiver granted, even though none have, that would be rescinded.
That's what the
so
bill
it seems
suggests, yes.
as though that this anticipates some egregious wrongdoing, and that we have somehow unearthed some clandestine subterranean plot on the parts of those vaunted laboratories of democracies that we call states. And there are people in the states who are struggling with more than 14 million people unemployed, perhaps to get them the tools that they need to succeed. But because Congress is doing such a good job of putting people back to work, we're going to preempt that. We're going to preempt that even in the case of whether or not someone has gotten a waiver, which they haven't, or in the case of making sure that nobody under this ironclad agreement is going to get out of these requirements, no matter what state or what the circumstances are. This will be ironclad. It's like an iron dome that we're making sure that we put over all these state legislative bodies, because there's got to be some clandestine subterranean reason why they're doing this. Is that a fair assessment of what's going on?
That's not how I would put it, sir.
The chair is not surprised.
Would the
Mr. White
gentleman
is saying.
yield? Would the gentleman yield for a minute?
Yes. Yes, the chairman. I'll leave you.
I think you should put on top of the dome the provision that HHS has said that the waiver would be granted only if the projects increased employment by at least 20%.
That's right.
You ought to put something on top of that dome. That's a
Or we all forfeit our pay.
All right, are there any further questions?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Becerra.
I don't believe there are any amendments, so while I don't really have questions of Mr. Weidinger, I could either move to strike the last word, I could just use this time. Should I just go ahead and go right now?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I think my colleague, our Chairman Emeritus of the Democratic Caucus just pointed out, this is a political solution in search of a problem. Here we are arguing about a political bill at a time when another meathead idea, the so-called sequester, will lead to some 750,000 Americans losing their jobs if we do nothing. And here we are doing nothing about sequester. I guess probably the best way to describe this bill is sequester-esque. It handcuffs the ability of governors to have the flexibility they need to put people to work. It prevents the federal government from giving our states and local governments the flexibility to put people back to work in the best way they think we can. It asks Washington, D.C. to be the micromanager of how best to put folks back home to work. And it essentially tells the executive, don't be the executive, let us in Congress be not just the legislators, but also the executives. This measure takes our Social Security laws, because that's the law that would be amended if this bill were to pass. It takes our Social Security laws and takes them down the route of our tax laws. More complex, less understandable, more Washington micromanaging. And I got to believe that most people would say this is a measure that it would be a blow to local control, something that my colleagues on the Republican side say they're always for. Here you have a governor from Utah saying, I'd like flexibility. I'd love to have that waiver because I intend to put more people to work, and test me on it. It's crazy. Why would anyone oppose an effort to merely test whether there are better ways to connect people out of work to a job, especially when the waiver requires you to show not just more people will be put to work under your new innovative proposal, but 20% more people to work is the goal. And so here we are, sequester-esque, dealing with a political bill that will go nowhere, while right now 750,000 Americans, we're told by the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan arbiter of what we do on fiscal matters, is telling us that some 750,000 Americans are going to lose their job because of the so-called sequester, this senseless, mindless meat axe approach to cuts to our federal government. And tell the 16,000 military teachers and staff who work on at our military schools, who were just told they would be furloughed, that sequester is a good idea. Tell the TSA officers at our airports who are being furloughed that this is a good idea. Tell the 70,000 children in America who probably will find no opening for Head Start that this is a good idea, and then maybe we'll make some progress. But right now, this is a political solution in search of a problem, and I hope that we defeat this measure. And with that, I'll yield back my time.
Mr. Weidinger, would you please outline the 12 activities that count as work? You've mentioned them several times, but just for the education of the committee. So this would be the half of the welfare recipients that must work. What is included in those 12 items?
Certainly. First item is unsubsidized employment, so that is what would normally be known as a job. Second is subsidized private sector employment. Third is subsidized public sector employment. Fourth is work experience, on-the-job training, job search and job readiness assistance, community service programs, vocational educational training, providing child care services to an individual who's participating in a community service program, job skills training directly related to employment, education directly related to employment, and satisfactory attendance at a secondary school or in a course of study leading to a GED.
All right, thank you. I don't believe there are any amendments. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 890 to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed signify by saying no. No. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. A roll call is demanded. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Nunez? Aye. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Aye. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Aye. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Buchanan? Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith? Aye. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Aye. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly? Aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin? Mr. Griffin, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott? No. Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? No. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? No. Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? No. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? No. Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? No. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Ms. Schwartz? Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Roscom? Aye. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Crowley? Ms. Schwartz? Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
20 yeas, 14 nays.
There being 20 ayes and 14 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 890 is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.